Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and today I read a book that I've had literally for almost 20 years. I've had this book on my shelf for so long, and I just on a whim kind of thought about it and thought, I wonder if that book's any good. And so I read the book, and I was going along, and I was like, this is pretty good. And then the end, and it blew my mind. Wow. Let's talk about Head Game by Tim Downs. Now, yes, this is not a middle grade or YA novel. This is an adult thriller novel. And so every now and again, I do read them. It's a possibility. So Head Game, this was put out back in like 2008 or so. And so I've had this book for a long time. And this is a first printing hardcover with the dust jacket. I've had it for a very long time. I bought it brand new when it first came out because I thought, oh, it looks interesting. I kind of want to read that. And I did finally, and I can't believe I waited so long because this was so fun. Now, this is a psychological, slightly slow burn thriller. And I need to say that it's slightly slow burn because the beginning parts are a little bit slow, but it makes up for it in the character development that made me cry, and I couldn't believe it. I kind of went into this book thinking like, okay, thriller book, okay, here we go. This is going to be a thing. And it made me cry. We're going to talk about why did it make me cry in a minute here. But Head Game, this book is about this guy named Cale, and he used to be, Cale, it's kind of funny to say out loud. But not Cale like the food, C-A-L-E, Cale. So Cale fought in the Persian Gulf War, and that is very important to this book because he was actually not a soldier on the front lines kind of person. He was actually the person who wrote propaganda leaflets and helped drop them in Iraq when he was there overseas deployed. And his good friend Kirby was also someone who did the art for these ads that they did, these propaganda ads that they made. And then also there was another character named Pug who was kind of like their commanding officer and who oversaw their missions. So you had these three characters. They are all involved in what was happening in the Persian Gulf War. And this was an interesting backdrop, which made me I remember thinking, like, I was alive during the Persian Gulf War, but I don't remember a ton about it, and I didn't ever really know much about it. And so after I read this book, I actually went and did a lot of research on the Persian Gulf War because I wanted to learn more about, like, why were we involved in the conflict? Like, what was happening? Like, what was going on? What started this? Why did the U.S. get involved? All these sorts of questions. And it was a very interesting thing. I was like, wow, this is very complicated. There's a lot going on here, and it's very interesting. And so I really was intrigued by that after reading this book because I'd never read anything that really took place in the Persian Gulf War. I feel like most of the stuff I've read was either like a lot of Vietnam stuff or World War II, World War I, or even some more modern day stuff with things going on in like Afghanistan, places like that. And so this book was very different to me. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it because I feel like it adds this fascinating layer because Cale, after the Persian Gulf War, actually went into advertising. And I thought that was a fascinating thing to do and compare advertising with propaganda. And I really loved that exploration in this book. And that is a theme in this book: propaganda, head games, things that people are doing to try and convince you of things and get you to think certain things. I was fascinated by that. And soon, Cale learns that his good friend Kirby is no longer alive. And he goes to help sort out the affairs and kind of get things buttoned up. And it comes out that Kirby actually took his own life. And so Cale sets off after this and starts to encounter some odd things going on in his own life. And soon everything in his life is unraveling. And is someone playing a head game with him? Or is the past come back to haunt him? And oh, this book, like I said, I kind of went into this at first being like, all right, we got a thriller here. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then I realized, oh, this is a psychological thriller. It's a little more of a slow burn. And it really was a slow burn, but there was enough character stuff going on, and you learn some pieces of information early on that you're thinking, ooh, I know something Cale does not know. And that is really interesting. And I don't know how this is all going to play out at the end of the day. And so that I thought was really fascinating to see the pieces slowly coming together for the reader. And Cale is spinning, wondering what's happening, like what's going on. And then there were two giant plot twists that I literally gasped out loud. I scared my wife because I was reading, we were both reading books, and all of a sudden I just am saying like, what? I can't believe this. And she's like, what's wrong? And I said, no, it's okay. No, it's just the book. And she's learned enough by now to know that I often gasp out loud if I'm reading a book and something really surprises me. So she started laughing at me and it was great. But there were two huge plot twists I never saw coming. Now, someone else might, I don't know. But to me, I did not see these coming, and it was incredible. Incredible. The ending sequences, the mind games, everything that's going on is so much fun. And I so enjoyed it. It was so great. I loved it. There is action here in the book. There's some moments where there's some car chases, some different things happening. So you do have some action sequences. But like I said, this book also made me cry. And it made me cry because there is a deep exploration of Cale's character, because you do find out early on in the first chapter that Cale's wife has passed away. And so Cale is like working through those emotions and like thinking about that and like, how is this changing his life? How is this changing his world, his day to day? And that is a huge piece of this book, this exploration of grief. And I thought that was just a great thing to add on, because while we're talking about propaganda and ads, we're also thinking about the ways that our own brain plays tricks on us and makes us think certain things and makes us wonder, like, if I had just done X, would this be different? And I thought that was such an interesting pairing with the idea of grieving a person, because I think that grief is a very difficult thing to work through, and it hits people so differently, and it's never the same twice. And grief always has these like layers to it, just like an ad or a propaganda piece does. And I think that while an ad and propaganda obviously are a more crass kind of thing in a lot of ways to us, grief feels more soulful and more emotional and much more real. And grief is something that can play with our minds too. And I thought that was a very interesting aspect of grief to think through, and how Cale processes his wife's death throughout the book really is powerful stuff. And I really, really enjoyed that. Now, one of the other interesting things about this book is the opening chapters actually comic book panels. And so I wanted to show you just a couple of the panels here, because the opening chapter is written in comic format, which I thought was really interesting. And at first I thought, like, why are we doing this? Like, okay, this is kind of a gimmick to sell the book. What are we doing? But then it comes around and it's interesting, because the reason why there's comic panels at the beginning of this book, oh, that's fascinating. That is fascinating. And I loved it. So the first chapter is told in a comic book style, and then the rest of the book is told all in prose. But Tim Downs, the author, actually was the cartoonist for those comic panels at the beginning of the book. And according to the back of the book, they talk about how the publisher said, well, what if you did the first chapter in comics instead of as prose? And Tim Downs was thinking, oh, okay, they'll hire somebody. And they said, well, why don't you draw it? And so he did, because he was a cartoonist for a very long time. He did a weekly Sunday morning cartoon called The Downstown. And it's a funny little comic strip that he had going for quite a while there. And so then he started writing some books. He wrote this book, and then this is a standalone book. There's no sequel. There's no nothing like that. This is standalone completely. And then he wrote a couple other books, and he has one series that has like recurring characters. But this one one is a standalone. And so he wrote this book with that first comic book chapter, and it was so fun. I really enjoyed it. I think you do have to go into this book, though, knowing that this is a product of its time. And what I mean by that is there are some interesting characterizations in this book, and some of the things that are shown and characterized were kind of interesting. And I thought, this feels a little on the edge for me of, is that a real depiction or is that made up and kind of a caricature of a people group? And so that was a very interesting thing, and I was really not decided on it by the end of the book. I was kind of like, I don't really know. I'm going to set that aside for now because I feel like I might be reading into it too much, so I'm just going to set that aside and keep going. But at the end of the day, I really did enjoy this book quite a bit. Like I said earlier on, there are some interesting subject matters, and this book is heavy. There is some heavy topics discussed where you have some very intense moments. You have some intense discussions about grief and death, and I don't think you should go into those lightheartedly or just flippantly. I think that this is a pretty intense character study of grief in a lot of ways. And then the head game piece of it, the psychological thriller, is the forefront of this story, but that grief is a secondary piece there. And for a minute, I actually was going to stop reading because I kind of have a rule that I don't read sad books. It's just a thing I don't do. I don't really love feeling sad, so I don't really like to read sad books and sad things. So I kind of try to avoid them. But this one I was okay with because, like I said, it was secondary and it was important to the story, and it was a really good processing of grief. So at the end of the day, I would have to give Head Game a solid 4.5 out of 5 stars. I think the beginning, like I said, was just a tiny bit of a slow burn. I think it needed something a little bit more kind of in that beginning middle to kind of get you going a little bit faster of what was happening in the book. But otherwise, it was so fun. And like I said, those 2 twists at the end left me like gasping out loud because I could not believe what was happening. It was so much fun. So I definitely would recommend Head Game. I think it's a lot of fun. It's by Tim Downs. One other thing, it's actually technically published by a Christian publisher, and it says that it's a Christian book, but there was nothing in it that was overtly Christian or talking about, God, church, the Bible, etc. That just wasn't a part of the conversation. It is, I would say, a mostly clean book in one sense. There is violence that is pretty gory here and there, but there's no language or anything like that. So that was kind of an interesting thing to me. But one last side note. But otherwise, this was definitely a fun one to read. I really enjoyed it. So until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye.